Here is one of the most counterintuitive findings in behavioral economics, and one of the most important. The more you think about money, obsessively, anxiously, constantly, the worse your financial decisions become. Not slightly worse. Measurably, significantly, documentably worse. The constant mental occupation with financial concerns does not sharpen your money management. It degrades it. And the degradation follows a specific, predictable pattern that researchers have been studying for over 2 decades. This is the scarcity mindset trap. And once you understand how it works, you'll recognize it as one of the most common self-defeating patterns in personal finance. Hiding in plain sight is what looks like financial diligence. Subscribe before we go deeper. New video every week. Let's get specific. The scarcity mindset was formalized as a psychological concept in the landmark 2013 book by Sendhil, Mullainathan and Eldar, Shafir, Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Their core finding, supported by extensive experimental research, is this. When people experience scarcity of any resource, time, money, food, social connection, their cognitive functioning changes in specific, predictable ways. The central mechanism is what they call the bandwidth tax. Scarcity captures mental bandwidth, the limited cognitive resource available for attention, decision-making, and self-control. When scarcity is present, it occupies a portion of that bandwidth automatically and involuntarily. The remaining bandwidth is reduced. And reduced bandwidth produces reduced cognitive performance across all domains, not just the domain of the scarcity. The money-specific version. When financial scarcity is present, money-related concerns continuously occupy a portion of your working memory and attention. The calculation running in the background, can I cover this, what happens if that, how do I manage the gap, does not pause when you're making unrelated decisions. It runs all the time. And every minute it runs, it reduces the bandwidth available for everything else. Here's where it gets specifically counterintuitive. The trap isn't just that scarcity thinking makes you less effective at non-financial things. The trap is that it makes you less effective at financial things specifically. This seems paradoxical. If you're thinking about money constantly, shouldn't that improve your financial decisions? The research says no, emphatically. Here's why. The mental occupation of scarcity thinking is not the same as focused financial problem solving. It's more like a continuous background alarm than a productive analysis. The alarm fires repeatedly, drawing your attention to the threat. But repeatedly attending to the threat signal consumes exactly the cognitive resources, working memory, executive function, prefrontal cortex capacity, that are required for the complex, multi-step financial problem solving that would actually resolve the underlying situation. You end up cognitively exhausted by thinking about money without actually making progress on the underlying problem. The thinking is the exhaustion, not the solution. Mullainathan and Shafir tested this with remarkable precision. In one study, they gave participants a complex financial scenario and measured their performance on a subsequent cognitive test. Participants who had been primed to think about financial hardship, even briefly, performed significantly worse on the cognitive test than those who hadn't. The financial thinking itself, not the financial situation, was the bandwidth drain. The second layer of the trap, tunneling. Scarcity thinking produces tunneling, a narrowing of attention to the most immediate, most salient aspect of the scarce resource. With money scarcity, the tunnel is the immediate financial problem. The bill due this week. The balance today. The gap right now. Tunneling is temporarily helpful. It focuses attention on the urgent problem. But it comes at the cost of what Mullainathan and Shafir call the outside the tunnel. Everything that's relevant but not immediately salient. The tax deadline next month. The investment opportunity you heard about last week. The salary negotiation you've been meaning to prepare for. The debt payoff plan that requires thinking several months ahead. When you're tunneled on the immediate financial problem, these outside the tunnel items don't just feel less important. They become genuinely less visible. Attention is a limited resource, and the tunnel consumes it. Research on tunneling consistently shows that people under scarcity miss time-sensitive opportunities, forget important non-urgent tasks, and fail to consider long-term consequences of short-term decisions. Not because they're irresponsible, but because the tunnel captured their available attention. The most expensive consequence of tunneling is what researchers call future neglect. The systematic underinvestment in future-oriented thinking when the present demands are consuming bandwidth. Future neglect is why people in financial scarcity rarely think about retirement, rarely plan for large future expenses, and rarely invest in skills or education that would improve their future earning power. The tunnel doesn't include those items. The third layer, the trade-off thinking exhaustion. People in financial scarcity make more trade-off computations per day than people with financial buffers. Every spending decision requires an explicit trade-off calculation. If I spend this on food, what don't I have money for? If I buy this, what can I buy? This constant trade-off calculation is mentally taxing in ways that non-scarce decision-making is not. When you have a financial buffer, many spending decisions require no trade-off calculation. The money is there, the decision is unconstrained. When you don't, almost every spending decision requires explicit trade-off analysis. The cognitive tax of constant trade-off computation is significant and cumulative. Research shows that the quality of decision-making degrades progressively across a day that involves heavy trade-off computation. By the time a financially scarce person reaches the end of a typical day, they have made dozens or hundreds of explicit financial trade-offs, and their decision-making capacity has been systematically depleted. The decisions they make late in the day when depleted are measurably worse than decisions made when fresh. This is one of the documented mechanisms by which poverty produces financially poor decisions. Not a character deficit, but a cognitive resource deficit driven by the sheer number of financial trade-offs that daily life requires under scarcity. If this analysis is shifting how you think about your own financial patterns, subscribe. This is exactly the kind of framework I put out every week. The fourth layer, the borrowing trap. Here's the most structurally damaging consequence of scarcity thinking, and the one that most directly perpetuates financial difficulty. What Mullainathan and Shafir call borrowing from the future. When a current problem consumes your tunnel focus, a bill due, a shortage this week, the natural response is to solve it immediately by borrowing from future resources. This might be literal borrowing, a payday loan, a credit card advance, or behavioral borrowing, working overtime this week and depleting energy you'll need next week, spending savings you were building for a future goal. Each act of borrowing from the future solves the current tunnel problem, but creates a new future problem that will itself become a tunnel problem when it arrives. The payday loan solves this week's gap and creates next week's repayment problem plus interest. The overtime depletes this month's energy and creates next month's reduced capacity. The emptied savings eliminates this month's emergency expense and creates next month's vulnerability. The scarcity trap perpetuates itself through this borrowing mechanism. Present scarcity drives borrowing from the future, which creates future scarcity, which creates future tunneling, which drives more borrowing. Breaking this cycle requires interrupting the borrowing behavior, which requires a financial buffer that allows the current tunnel problem to be solved without consuming future resources. The buffer is not just a financial asset. It is a scarcity trap interrupt mechanism. So what do you actually do about scarcity mindset when you're in it? The honest answer is that the most effective intervention is reducing actual scarcity, which is the point of the entire financial foundation building sequence discussed in other videos. But while you're building toward that reduction, there are specific cognitive interventions that reduce the bandwidth tax of scarcity thinking without requiring that the financial situation has already changed. Intervention 1. Scheduled financial thinking. Instead of allowing financial thinking to run as a continuous background process consuming bandwidth all day, corral it into a defined, scheduled window. 30 minutes on Sunday evening. Your financial thinking happens then. Outside of that window, when financial worry thoughts intrude, you acknowledge them and defer them. I'll think about this Sunday. This deferral doesn't eliminate the thought. It delays it to a time when you've allocated bandwidth for it. Over time, the background alarm quiets as the brain learns that financial thinking has a designated channel. This sounds like willpower. It isn't quite. It's a timed scheduling protocol that reduces the random access pattern of scarcity thinking. The same way a work inbox doesn't consume your bandwidth all day if you check it at defined times, a money review window prevents financial anxiety from consuming bandwidth continuously. Intervention 2. Tunnel awareness. Deliberately cultivate awareness of when you're in the tunnel. Ask yourself periodically, am I solving a current problem or am I tunneled? If tunneled, explicitly schedule time for outside the tunnel thinking, not as immediate action but as a deliberate cognitive shift. Set a calendar reminder for 1 week from now, outside the tunnel review. At that review ask, what am I missing because my tunnel currently doesn't include it? Tunnel awareness doesn't require that you solve the problem you're tunneled on. It just ensures that the items outside the tunnel don't permanently disappear from your consideration. Intervention 3. Trade-off reduction through automation. Every financial trade-off you automate is a trade-off computation removed from your daily cognitive load. The more of your financial life runs on automatic, bills paid automatically, savings transferred automatically, investments contributed automatically, the fewer explicit trade-off calculations you're making each day. Reducing the daily trade-off count reduces the cognitive depletion that scarcity thinking produces. Intervention 4. The slack creation mindset. Mullainathan and Shafir's most important practical recommendation. Deliberately create slack, small financial buffers, extra time margins, resource reserves, wherever possible. Even tiny slack, $50 extra in checking before payday, a spare hour in the week schedule, reduces the bandwidth tax of scarcity thinking. The brain responds to slack the way a computer responds to available RAM. Performance improves. The counterintuitive implication, spending to create slack is sometimes worth it. If paying for a service that saves 2 hours of mental overhead per week reduces your scarcity thinking bandwidth tax enough to improve your financial decision quality, the spending has a positive financial return. Not always, but sometimes the efficiency gain exceeds the cost. Here's the synthesis. Thinking about money all day is not financial diligence. It is scarcity bandwidth consumption that degrades the cognitive functions needed for effective financial management. The goal is not to think more about money, it's to think better in scheduled windows with reduced tunnel distortion and reduced daily trade-off load. The scarcity mindset trap is not permanent. It responds to the same things that reduce actual scarcity: buffer building, debt reduction, income growth, and it also responds to the cognitive management strategies that reduce its bandwidth consumption independent of the financial situation. You don't have to fix your finances before you can think clearly about them. But you do have to manage how you think about them so the thinking doesn't prevent the fixing. Subscribe for more. Drop a comment below. Do you recognize the scarcity mindset in your own financial thinking? Tell me what it looks like for you.